Good morning, everybody. Good morning. I'm going to invite people to come in and take their seats. On behalf of the Furman Center, I want to welcome you to our first policy breakfast of the fall of 2019. I'm Kathy O'Regan. I'm one of the faculty directors of the Furman Center, along with Ingrid Gould-Ellen. And I'm going to take a minute and just remind people or tell you for the first time what the Furman Center is about. So the Furman Center is a joint center between the NYU's Law School and the Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. And so I'm going to start with a thank you to Trevor Morrison, who's the Dean of NYU's Law School, and Sherry Gleed, who's the Dean of Wagner, for their continued and strong support. So a key part of the Furman Center's mission is to promote frank and productive discussions about issues in land use, real estate, and urban policy. And one of the main ways that we do that is this Policy Breakfast series, bringing together a group of people to kind of take the time to think about what do we know and what don't we know about an issue from various and not always agreeing perspectives, adding and assessing evidence, and asking questions so that we push forward our understanding. And I want to thank you all who are here today and watching for taking time out of your busy schedule to join in that conversation. And so today's focus is on recent tenant protection law and initiatives in New York City, an important topic. And we've put together a really terrific panel who are going to kind of lead us in a deep dive of thinking about what we know and what should we be doing now. And with that, I'm just going to hand this over to Matt Murphy, who is the Furman Center's Executive Director and alum of the Wagner School. He's going to be moderating today's panel. Matt?
Thank you. Good morning. Thanks for coming. So as Kathy mentioned, we're going to be discussing recent tenant protection laws and initiatives in New York City. We have an outstanding panel about to come to the stage, but to set the context for this conversation, I want to provide a brief review of some of the city's initiatives. When I say the city, I'm talking about the local city, largely driven by local legislation that have focused on protecting tenants from harassment. I think it's very important that we understand this trajectory, which I'll take you through. While the 2019 rent law changes by far garner the most attention paid to this topic, the evidence tells us that since 2014, the reality is that a number of local laws have preceded these changes. Most of these laws are deliberately intending to address concerns of tenant harassment and illegal displacement. So today we're going to take a peek at these laws and move to develop a shared understanding of the issues that are being legislated, how and whether this landscape has indeed changed here, and how it may continue to evolve. So let's start with the definition of harassment as currently written in the city's Housing Maintenance Code. We as a city define a lot of things, and this includes harassment, and it's written here in its most current form. A few of the recent legislative activities have actually focused on expanding this definition. So this definition was actually different a few years ago. And as you'll notice, if you're reading diligently, you'll see that we have not included the specific acts and omissions. That's largely because it would probably be about 30 more slides. But I'll give you a few examples. And we will also post this to our website so you can see. One is using force against or making threats of force against any person lawfully entitled to occupancy of a dwelling unit, repeated interruptions or discontinuances of essential services, and removing the possessions of any person lawfully entitled to occupancy of such dwelling unit. And as I mentioned, there are many, many more. So I'd ask you to keep this definition in mind as we go back to 2014 to understand the trajectory of the local laws we're discussing. In 2014, City Council amended a local law that increased civil penalties for harassment, while also making those violations more public by requiring them to be posted to the city's website. In 2015, the city amended the Housing Maintenance Code to regulate financial offerings, or better known as buyout offers, from their landlord. In short, this included several laws targeted at illegal or intimidating behavior when making a buyout offer, the requirement of more disclosures around buyout offers, such as in writing describing that a tenant can refuse that offer or could have access to an attorney, and also allowing the right for tenants to refuse contact for 180 days if the contact is in regards to a buyout offer. A separate amendment actually made this latter behavior illegal or a defined form of harassment if successive bio-offers are made in an unwanted way within that 180-day period. It was at this time as well that the city created a anti-harassment task force. The city enacted a number of initiatives in 16 and 17 that focused on eviction protection and tenant harassment. This included a law requiring Human Resources Administration to provide rental subsidy applicants with written notice of the city's eviction protections. Separately, it amended the definition of harassment to add a rebuttable presumption, where the court assumes the truth unless someone comes forward to contest it and prove otherwise regarding harassment. Another law expanded the definition of harassment to include visiting a tenant repeatedly or at unusual hours. Arguably one of the city's largest efforts, known as Local Law 136, which is listed out of numerical order here, just so you know, initiated the city's Right to Counsel program. The law requires that by July of 2022, in a few years, all tenants in a housing court would have access to brief legal assistance prior to their first court appearance, and income-eligible ones would receive full legal representation. This program, because of its scale, is being rolled out currently. In 2017, a slew of law changes allowed tenants to collect compensatory damages from an offending landlord, also expanded the required disclosure of additional information when construction work takes place in occupied residential buildings. These are known as tenant protection plans, and the law requires them to be publicly posted in areas as well. You might have actually seen these near your elevator. I actually just saw my first one a couple weeks ago. Separately, legislation was passed to penalize repeated acts of harassment by the discontinuance or repeated interruption of essential services. And at this time, we also saw the minimum amount of civil penalties required for violations due to tenant harassment increase. We also expanded the anti-harassment provisions that I've described to apply not only to multiple dwellings, but private dwellings, which are 1 to 2 unit homes. In 2018, a number of efforts became law, including the creation of a certification of no harassment pilot program, which requires certain buildings to go through an investigation for harassment prior to obtaining construction permits, and also created a publicly available watch list of recently sold rent-regulated buildings. A separate law amended the definition of harassment again to include acts targeting false certifications on construction documents and lying about the regulated status of the unit on those construction documents. Finally, Local Law 62 requires HPD to create an online portfolio of registered property owners with information required on each property they own, the number of outstanding violations on that property, and other required data. This takes us to 2019. Most recently, the City Council passed a package of 17 bills this spring, and I'll highlight a few here. In June of 2019, the disclosures upon required buyout offers that I mentioned was revisited to require landlords to provide the median rent of the community district where the buyout offer is made using rent information supplied by HPD. Also at this time, a new chapter of the Housing Maintenance Code was written to require landlords to report buyout agreements with their tenants to HPD within 90 days of execution, and disclose information like the value of that buyout agreement. We also had a number of bills passed that focused on heightened review at the Department of Buildings. I'll not mention all of them, but I'll mention a few. One was denying building permits where a residential building has an excessive number of violations. Another is heightened review of the tenant protection plans I mentioned and increased enforcement of those. And penalties on those tenant protection plans for any false statements that are made. Finally, we also saw actions to provide more information to tenants and the public, including required information on DOB violations that is reported to HPD, the public notice of open violations in common areas and affected units, and the requirement to provide 4 years of rental history to incoming tenants, which was actually preempted by state law to require 6 years of rental history on rent-regulated properties. So, speaking of the rent laws, while they are not necessarily our primary focus here, as I mentioned, there is a trajectory that occurred between 14 and 19 that amended those laws significantly. I must mention that these laws focused, and this has been well documented, on mitigating rent increase mechanisms, but the laws also expanded protections to all renters in the state, not just rent-regulated ones. They touch on things like required lease renewal notices, eviction protections, civil penalties and misdemeanor classification for illegal evictions, regulating security deposits, and also a number of other provisions. So, with this context, and there's a lot, we will now turn to our fantastic panel to discuss what all this has meant and we think will mean for the city, for tenants, landlords, housing court, and public agencies. So I'm delighted to welcome our panels to the stage. Come on up. All right, so you're now honorary lawyers. You learned the law in less than 5 minutes. Okay, so you can find the full bios of the panelists in front of you. We also included a note card that if you want to write questions on, we'll have a small group of people going around to collect those, and which we'll save for the end. But I do want to just introduce everybody one by one, starting to my direct right. So I'm proud to introduce Jackie Bray, who's the director of the Mayor's Office to Protect Tenants. Jackie Bray is 6 months into her job, and so she is just learning the ropes and getting up to speed, and she is fantastic. Next to my right, Magda Rosa Rios. Magda is the director of the Housing Justice Unit Group Advocacy, acting attorney in charge at the Harlem Community Law Office at the Legal Aid Society. Next is Rima Begum. Rima is a community organizer at Shia CDC. And next to Rima is Brent Meltzer. Brent is the chief of the Housing Protection Unit at the New York State Office of the Attorney General. And to the right of Brent, and for no particular reason, is Erica Buckley, who's a partner at Nixon Peabody. So, we presented an overview of recently enacted laws, and these are intended to protect tenants from bad actors, harassment, and illegal displacement. So we want to get a sense from you guys what this period has shown us, as well as a sense of the scale of the issues that we're trying to address. So Rima, I actually want to start with you and get your reaction to some of these efforts as someone who's working with and organizing tenants on a daily basis. Can you tell us whether you've seen some changes and whether your organizing strategies have changed?
Sure, absolutely. Just want to make sure the mic works. Cool. All right. I noticed a few things on the ground. One, kind of like immediately after the rent laws, there was kind of a hush, like a silence that happened amongst landlords. And when I say landlords, I mean like corporate landlords, right? That's really who we're talking about. We're not talking about like small homeowners. And I know that sometimes those terms get thrown around and we're not really conceptualizing who we're talking about. So kind of immediately after, there was a little bit of like a quietness. And I think for me in particular, I kind of found that a little scary because I'm like, their minds are turning, right? They're thinking about new strategies. They're trying to find loopholes in the already great rent laws that we passed. I have noticed that some landlords, I have to give them some credit, were following some very particular laws that were a little more clear-cut, right? So like the preferential rent was a little more clear-cut, but some of the other laws that were a little more just intense in the way the law was written. So for example, like MCIs, there are so many nuances to that law, and so I think there was a lot of confusion for organizers as well as management offices and corporate landlords of when does this go into effect, how does it, apply. A lot of my tenants who live in Queens, and I work with a large South Asian population, mostly Bangladeshi folks, they were like celebrating, which I think that they deserved, right? They did a lot of organizing work, went up to Albany, marched, spoke to elected officials, And I think that they deserve this kind of moment in which they're able to celebrate their power of coming together, not only with New York City residents, but also like with our upstate allies.
That's great. And so Magda, I want to turn to you and ask a similar question. You're in housing court. You're using laws to protect tenants from harassment and prevent unnecessary evictions. So how has your experience changed over the last few years, if it has? And do you think that this subset of laws and in combination with the rent laws is having an effect?
So first, I want to say something to what Rena said, which is that the laws were targeting or meant to target corporate landlords, but in my view, but in my view, the laws are actually meant to target any landlord that's a bad actor. And that can be a corporate landlord, that can be a huge landlord, but we actually come across a good number of smaller landlords, smaller meaning that they don't own huge numbers of properties, or they don't have 100-unit buildings, but bad actors nonetheless. I think that for us, what we saw throughout this time, I work primarily with tenant associations, and so one of the things that we saw was that tenants didn't trust that the laws are actually going to help them. For us, it was actually a great thing to be able to add harassment as part of our HP complaints or as part of our litigation strategy.
And can you explain HP complaints to the audience?
Oh, I'm sorry. An HP complaint is a housing part action brought in housing court by tenants or by HPD to force landlords to make the to provide needed services and to make repairs in the property. And the harassment law actually makes how you bring a harassment complaint in housing court is by an HP proceeding. So you can bring an HP proceeding for repairs and services, you can bring an HP proceeding for harassment, or you can bring both, which is what we typically do, is at the most.
That's great. And so, Erica, I want to move to you because you're very uniquely positioned in this conversation, having worked at the AG, kind of holding a form of what Brent's job is now. And now, as an attorney, you're helping real estate owners actually navigate these laws. So can you talk a little bit about this progression?
Sure. I think one of the reasons why I'm on the panel is I'm a recovering regulator, as they say. And I guess I wanted to work on the other side of the table to see what was really out there. And I have to say it's not exactly what I saw as a regulator. And so what I experience on a regular basis are landlords that actually want to do the right thing and are having a particularly hard time right now navigating the regulatory landscape because it's incredibly complex. And as your presentation sort of demonstrated, I think we have kind of gotten to a point where maybe we've gone a little bit too far with the regulations and with trying to control every single action. So that's kind of what I've been experiencing.
Just following up, based on Magda's point, do you see a distinction between small landlords and large landlords, or is that something that you have not really come across?
I mean, I think yes and no. I mean, I have to say that people generally come to me because they know that I was a regulator and they want to work with someone like me so that they do the right thing. So I don't have Steve Croman coming to me and saying, hey, let's figure out how to, game the law. I don't think I would ever represent someone like that anyway. So, the types of developers that come to me, whether they're large or small, they want to do the right thing. And they're genuinely confused and a little overwhelmed. So, that is something that I'm seeing. And it has gotten a lot more pervasive since my time as a regulator, where, again, we were using the executive law, which was one law that allowed us to go after a whole series of acts of fraud or illegality. And now there are just so many different local laws and rules, it makes it very complicated to know if you're doing the right thing.
Yeah. So Jackie and Brent, I want to move on to you guys. You've both taken on centralized roles, Jackie for the city, Brent for the Attorney General. You have the words protect and something related to housing and tenants in your titles. So I'd like for you guys, Jackie, we'll start with you, to kind of describe the origins of your units, the scale of the issues that you're seeing, and what you've already seen kind of crop up in your roles.
Yeah, sure. Well, good morning, first of all. I think it's useful to always take a step back, to be honest, and every single one of us is working in this context of a crisis. And I think often when we're talking about the nuance of policy, we sort of lose the big picture of there is an active crisis going on, and there are humans in crisis, and the housing market is driving many things about that crisis for individuals. And so I think all of us are operating in that context, and all of the lawmakers are operating in that context too, right? It's not just the regulators or the, outside lawyers or the tenant lawyers or the owner lawyer, all of us are trying to grasp our way to policy that address what is a genuine crisis for millions of New Yorkers, likely, right? Whether it's sort of, are there millions of New Yorkers on the precipice of losing housing? Probably not, no. But there are millions of New Yorkers who are frightened about housing, right? Or something about their housing. So we're all working in that context, and I think it's sort of important to ground ourselves there. I think the creation of my office is a recognition of that. The Mayor's Office to Protect Tenants was announced in January of this year. I didn't come on as its first director until May. I really have 2 or 3 primary goals that were goals from the outset of the creation of the office. The first and most important is to think about how do we get ahead of and get ahead of illegal behavior on the part of landlords. And I sort of agree with Erica that many landlords are trying to do the right thing. And that many landlords, we're now in a regulatory framework where it's actually can be hard to figure out what that thing is. But I, as we see every day, many landlords are also bad actors in this market space. And so how does the city coordinate our enforcement agencies to get ahead of illegal behavior on the part of owners that leads to displacement? Leads to involuntary moves or forced moves. So those are the first thing of thinking about, the city has not one housing agency, I say, we probably have half a dozen. HPD has enforcement authority here. DOB has enforcement authority. The Department of Health has enforcement authority. The Department of Consumer and Worker Protection has enforcement authority. The law department has a role to play. There's a lot of coordination to happen. And that's even before you get to the fact that we have to coordinate with our state partners. So the office was created to help think about that coordination, help do some of that coordination, but also help think about what's our theory of change here, right? Are we playing whack-a-mole as an enforcement regime, as regulatory agencies, or do we actually have a theory about how we're impacting the market and bad actors to change behavior in the market? I think that's an open question for us. The second job of my office is to really increase the resources that the city is putting in towards giving tenants the tools that they need to be frontline enforcers. 3.3 million housing units in the city, 2.2 million rentals. There is no way the government is going to be able to be everywhere in that type of context and scale. Probably we don't want the government everywhere in that type of context and scale. So tenants need to feel empowered, and they need information and tools to feel that way, and good organizing and good tenant side lawyers, and the city has a role to play there. And then finally, what wasn't shared in my bio is that I come out of the Department of Homeless Services. And so the third piece of my job now, although I'm not sure it was inherent in the office so much as inherent in me as its first director, is to bring a real lens of the most vulnerable New Yorkers to all of our housing policy development in the city.
That's great. So Brent, can I ask you the same question?
I hate falling, Jackie. So I think before I actually answer your question, I wanted to come back to sort of the idea between sort of corporate versus non-corporate landlords. And I think the first thing to sort of say is that, for the tenant, it doesn't matter. Right, what they're experiencing is just either, lack of services, harassment, whatever is going on. And so I think that's the first thing to just remember. But as sort of either an organizer or as a lawyer or public policy person, you have to think through, like, what is driving what's happening? Is it speculation in the market, which I think was rampant for a while, and because of the new rent laws, I think hopefully is going to get sucked out of the market in some ways? Is it, a landlord who's struggling, who just can't afford the units? And so it requires different responses, and I think that there are a lot of tools out there sort of addressing all of that. So to answer your question, the Attorney General's office, spanning 2 administrations now, has been, I think, more deeply focused in on tenant issues. Not to say we hadn't been doing tenant issues prior. And before I got to the office, Erica and people know Dina Levy, she was a real driver at the office, was really trying to get us focused, and that's where the Steve Croman litigation came from. They reached out to me in part because Eric had left and they needed someone to take over her job, but also because I had a landlord-tenant background and someone who actually had some expertise in the areas that they were sort of delving into. And so I ran, for a while there, I was running the Real Estate Finance Bureau, and then my night job was sort of doing the tenant stuff. And I think we were doing a lot of it, and it was going on. For people who saw a recent IAI fraud case, the Drumheller case, I think it was a good example of the type of work that was going on. And so it's weird to talk about this new unit because it's not it's new in that we'll have more resources and we'll have a much more focus. There's going to be 4 attorneys now dedicated to tenant issues and affordable housing issues. It's just that it's continuing on. We're in a unique position because we're not only focused in on the city, we also look upstate and outside of the city, in Long Island, other places, and there's just unique things that are happening. In the city, we've gone through sort of a reinvestment, a gentrification of the city in lots of places, although there is some disinvestment. In other parts of the state, there's just massive disinvestment. We talk with localities, and there's like, yeah, landlords are abandoning our properties, and we can't enforce against them quick enough. Can you help us? And it's a radically different issue to kind of deal with. And so it's sort of, I'm happy to be in a position now to try to have to deal with all these issues that are going forth. So I don't know if I answered your question, but
No, that's
what we're doing.
great. And so, Jackie, I might just ask you a follow-up. Given the scale of those issues that do exist, how do you think that you'll be able to maintain clarity about the priorities for the office, or what do you think the priorities will be?
Well, I have certainly failed to maintain clarity for the last 6 months. I think the priorities are pretty straightforward, actually, for me. In an enforcement perspective, it is not my office's job to replicate what are really actually quite good, robust enforcement, I keep calling them regimes, but agencies, right? I mean, yes. Is there abuse out there that we are not catching? Absolutely. But what HPD does on a daily basis is massively impressive, and they do it with not a whole lot of resources. We have 300, give or take, housing maintenance code inspectors in this ginormous city, right? I don't know how many lawyers HPD has off the top of my head, but it's not as many as you would imagine or need. DOB's got the same challenges. It's DOB's job to sort of keep buildings from falling down. Really, very, very few buildings fall down in this city, and that's like not a joke, right? So I would say that we've got these great enforcement regimes, but what we have to do, and what is really challenging, is how do you have, I've been thinking about sort of this in 3 ways. How do you use those enforcement agencies to change behavior in the marketplace is not a question that any of the enforcement agencies have naturally asked themselves. Or if they've asked themselves it, the answer has been, well, in a resource-constrained world, we have to prioritize response to complaints, or we have to prioritize getting done what we can get done. So I think that for me, data, the way we share data and use data, and the way we communicate what we're doing are the 2 places where my office can add value and will add value. From that's in the sort of enforcement vertical. In the vertical around educating tenants, it's sort of my job to get out of the way and help support all of the work that our legal service providers and our tenant organizers are doing. It's phenomenal work. It's unique to this city that we have such robust tenant organizing and legal service providers ecosystems. We have to help them figure out how to be as resourced as possible. We need to put the resources in when we can put the resources in, and then we need to think about developing tools that help tenants be their own best advocates. That's sort of my top priority there.
That's great. So let's kind of move into talking about the targeting of these laws. I don't want to suggest from the presentation or even the conversation that this is only a recent effort. There is an entire history of protecting tenants in New York City that is extraordinary, really. But many recent efforts have actually targeted specific landlord behavior. So we saw something like the definition and amendment of the definition of harassment, tenant protection plans and what's allowed there, curbing of buyout offers. So I want to turn and get a sense from the panel, the need for specificity versus flexibility when we're targeting specific behavior. So Rima, again, starting with you. So, we've seen initiatives target buildings, specific neighborhoods. We've seen efforts even come up to target specific lenders. So can you speak a little bit about this, and what do you make of these efforts?
So a lot of the reasons why we even come up with these efforts is because it's a pattern of behavior. It's not one sole actor acting in this heinous way. It's not one landlord just harassing one tenant. Oftentimes, as organizers, one person not having heat or hot water, usually the whole building is not having heat or hot water. And so it's really about patterns and behaviors. And right now, the way the patterns and behaviors are of landlords is in a malintent, to be really frank. I would love to see a list of landlords that want to follow the law and do it correctly. I'm happy to work with them, right? I want that because I want people to stay in their community. I want them to thrive in their community. And there's so many tenant organizers. I see tenant organizers in the audience right now that are throughout the city. And I'm sure we would be happy to work with landlords that are willing to abide by the law. But unfortunately, that's not the case. And so a lot of the work that organizers do, we do it collectively, to be honest. We're not doing it individually in one neighborhood. We're doing it collectively. We're doing it throughout Queens together. We're doing it citywide together. And then now the movement, this past year has been throughout the state because we recognize that there are issues in Long Island and upstate New York, in Syracuse and Buffalo, where there's still a housing crisis going on. And going back to the idea of everybody's working from a crisis point of view, that's very true, right? But the real crisis here is that people can't stay in their apartments no matter how much money they earn. Somehow, the market is just ballooning to these outrageous amounts, and we have the highest vacancy rate in Manhattan right now, but there's 60 or 70,000 people that are homeless. Something is wrong with that narrative. Something is going on. And so this is why it's important for us to not only just recognize what are the patterns, but to be able to say that this is how we fix the law, right? This is how we close the loopholes that are creating these patterns of behavior. And then the part after that I think a lot of people forget is implementing those laws. It's one thing to write the law and to make sure it looks nice and shiny and it passes, right? But the second part is making sure that they're implemented in the right way, or else they're pointless to tenants, right? They get watered down, they're still vague. And so it's really important for tenants, which a lot of tenants are doing right now, is working with DHCR, working with HPD, working with DOB, and once the law is passed on whatever level, city or state, that tenants are in the room, organizers are in the room to make sure that those laws are actually implemented in the right way. That's the only way that we're gonna curb displacement.
And so Magda, I'll follow up with you. Do you see advantages of defining specific behavior? You touched on this a little bit earlier, versus, say, letting the courts have more discretion?
There are definite advantages to having specifics. All the judges in the court are not the same. Everybody has different perspectives. People don't always understand or attach the same meaning to words that are written on paper. But words do matter, especially for me, because I'm a lawyer. So words do matter, and having a framework, having something to guide you is important. It's important for my clients, and it's important for my attorneys, and it's important for the court. But I don't think that discretion should be taken away from the courts, from the judges. There has to be some type of flexibility. Erica mentioned that she thinks we've gone too far in terms of the regulations. I don't necessarily agree with that, though I do think that there's a period right now. We actually have some good laws on the books. There are some good laws, but everybody doesn't know about the laws. Everybody does, and I'm speaking now from my side, from the tenants. The tenants certainly don't know about the laws. Some landlords think they don't know about the laws or try to make believe they don't know about the laws. So that's a big piece of it, is educating people about the laws. But now that we have these laws that are on the books, like Rima is saying, now we have to figure out, how do we enforce them? How do we make sure that they are enforced equitably and across the board? We need to have a period now where we see what's working, what's not working, what do we need to change? Some things we know already, like, there's already campaigns in terms of things that we're missing from the laws that just passed in June. But there are other things now that we just have to figure them out. And as we're figuring them out, I think that we do need to have discretion in terms of how to go with it.
That's great. And
I
so,
also just wanted to mention one
Yeah.
thing about good actors and bad actors. I mean, I've been doing L&T work for 30 years now. And in that time, I've come across, I mean, granted, people come to us when, again, everybody's in crisis, they have a problem, they need that problem fixed. And as I said, I work with tenant associations, so usually those problems are building, always, those problems are building wide. In my 30 years, I've come across 2 landlords, 2, that have said, I'm trying. Can you work with me? Can you help me? And the answer is always going to be yes. We're always going to say yes to that. But 2 out of 30. Usually it's, there are some that may not have the resources or the knowledge, but they take it to the extreme, to the point where it's, we just have to get rid of these clients. It's not about what I can do, these are bad tenants and we need to get rid of them. And that's a mentality that needs to change.
yeah. So actually, it's a good transition. Erica, in my former position as well, at HPD, you often heard anecdotally from other landlords that say, okay, we know that there are bad actors out there. Like, there is kind of a common knowledge that there is a small subset, and we've talked a little bit on the panel, there's a small subset that abuse the laws, and we have legislation that is kind of covering everybody, so to speak. So do you think that there is something to this, and are there ways that these kind of broadly targeted laws have implications?
Absolutely. And I mean, look, there's definitely bad activity going on out there. And again, my experience was, again, at the Attorney General's office, being able to use a very broad law that allowed the Attorney General to go after repeated and persistent acts of fraud and illegality. That was very broad, and it allowed the office to go after a whole array of wrongdoing without trying to spell out every possible activity that could be construed as tenant harassment. In terms of, one example that keeps coming into my head that just sort of demonstrates the absurdity of some of, the regulations would be, this new law on buyouts, that you have to provide notice to tenants that they may not be able to find a comparable apartment in their neighborhood. So I have to now advise clients who are offering buyouts to tenants that are paying like $15,000 a month to say that, which clearly, I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, that's like the maximum of what the rent is in the neighborhood. But if they don't do that, are they at risk of violating that law? They are. It's just, and again, I get where it was, where it comes from. It's the idea that the tenant that's paying $700 a month might lose that apartment, and there's no comparable apartment on the marketplace. So that's the type of thing that, I see on the other side of the table that just, it doesn't make sense. And there are other examples, and I think that that's where it becomes a little troubling.
And can I ask, how are people adapting to things like that? Are they just kind of throwing their hands up and saying, I'm confused, tell me what to do, Erica Buckley? Or are they saying, let's all figure this out?
Right. We will always err on the side of providing something that complies with the law, even if it seems a little absurd. And, you know, same thing with, you know, if there's any type of work going on in a building now because of, you know, all of the potential consequences of failing to, you know, properly post notices, a client will say, should I just put it in the lobby? Should I send it to everybody? I'm like, put it everywhere. Send it to everyone. Put it on every floor. Put it in the lobby. Put it everywhere. Oh, let's do it like beyond what's required, because the last thing you want is the DOB to come and see that you haven't posted your notice on one floor and you'll get a violation.
Sorry, Matt.
So, go ahead, Brent.
I,
Yeah.
I don't see where the administrative burden is on your clients.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a big deal to do this. I mean, obviously, my career's been focused in on low-income New Yorkers, but I also think, you know, housing's a right. And so having people of all income stratifications having notice and information is not a bad thing. And I don't think it's really that difficult to have that out for everybody out there. And so I don't know. I think it's
Well,
been.
if it's correct, I mean, I mean, again.
Well, but I mean,
if-
you may not is correct. It's not saying you will not, it's saying you may not, which is is true. I mean, that's a legitimate statement, and I mean, it's been incredibly helpful from our perspective for enforcement. You know, we can have people come in, and if we know they're doing bad things, but they're good at hiding it, it's the Al Capone issue, right? You get them for tax evasion, you don't get them for, you know, the bad things that they're doing, and we are able to affect change in the marketplace because of that.
So,
You know,
go ahead,
I,
Becky.
I would just also say that I think I have empathy for many owners in this regulatory framework, but real estate owners in New York City have done a terrible job at self-policing, right? They've done almost no self-policing. They've done almost no, you know, we all know that there were thousands, tens of thousands, you know, hundreds of thousands, probably not, but tens of thousands of people who were harassed out of their units in an effort to flip their units and deregulate over the last 20 years. That is a crisis for this city, and the good actors in the industry did nothing to stop that. So on one hand, I actually do have empathy if people are trying to do the right thing. And I do think that the regulatory framework has gotten really complex, right? All of those things are true. On the other hand, you know, to stack that burden against the crisis we're in or against the number of people who are losing housing or the number of people who are scared of losing housing, I think that's the thing, that in a vacuum, there's a lot of empathy there. There's a lot of understanding there. But you put that against 20 years of a lack of self-policing and a lack of stepping in and weeding out their own bad actors. And I'm not sure it stacks up.
So maybe I'll then ask kind of pitch a question to the whole panel. If it's the case that we've, you know, passed these laws and legislation and we're maybe in a period of kind of seeing how they work or how they play out and tinkering with them, are we distracted from the issue of things like tenant or resident instability? Or is focusing on harassment and illegal behavior here, should this be a primary focus for the city? Maybe Magda, I'll start with you.
I mean, for sure. Certainly from our point of view, the whole point of these laws is to
Maybe get a little.
is to stabilize communities, to have housing that's available for, in my case, housing that's available to low-income New Yorkers. Not just any housing, but safe, decent housing that people can live in. And that's how we're approaching these laws. That's the purpose of these laws. If you have safe, decent, affordable housing for all of the residents of the city, then you are stabilizing communities. I think part of the problem, one of the things that the laws don't address, obviously, is the fact that you have these skyrocketing rents, so hopefully that will abate a little bit now, but you had these skyrocketing rents, and people were not, my clients were not able to afford to stay in the apartments that they had lived in for years. And that caused a destabilization of the communities that they lived in, because they were now forced to leave those communities. Some of those apartments remain vacant, some of those apartments were taken, most of those apartments were then taken out of the market, and now you have a completely different feel and view of what is left in that community. That's something that we want to try to abate. We want to make sure that people have homes that they can live in, but we also want to address the quality of the homes, and that's something that a lot of owners just didn't address. Taking something out of the market because you could make more money meant that you were not investing in that property for years and years and years. There was an article yesterday that came out about a landlord complaining that he now couldn't renovate an apartment because he wouldn't be able to recoup the cost, which is actually not true. It'll just take them longer to recoup the cost, but they'll still be able to recoup it. But then what happened in the 20 years prior? They said that they did nothing for 20 years. That's exactly the type of behavior that these laws are meant to address. You can't just ignore properties for 20 years and then say these regulations are unfair.
So Rima, I would ask you to follow up. You're nodding.
Yeah, I'm actually agreeing here and also thinking about the buyout. I'm having a lot of things going on in my head. So I just want to address the buyout issue. So let's just be very clear about buyouts. Landlords understand the value of that apartment, one, and they also understand that tenants don't know the value of that apartment, two, hence why buyouts happen, right? So it is a business scheme. It is a business model. And so
Well, can I then maybe just devil's advocate and say,
Sure.
then how is it that self-enforcing or letting HPD know about this buyout offer, like, do we expect that to happen, that people will send in this information? Or is it about having it on the record that it didn't happen for future action?
in most cases, tenants who are being offered buyouts don't understand the value of their apartment, have not searched in the market yet, right? Don't know what a comparable apartment looks like. And in most cases, it's not in their community. And so reporting it to HPD kind of creates a trail, in a sense, right? For landlords who continuously do buyouts, right? And continuously act in these ways where they're offering people $20,000, for example, and most of the time they're offering these to people who are low income, right? People that look like me, right? People of color who probably have never seen that much amount of money, right? And so you get very happy, right? Maybe this $20,000 is gonna help me put a down payment on something, not realizing that there's so much speculation in the single family market, right? And the multifamily market that they really can't purchase anything or even live off of that money for even a year. And then the second part is that they don't understand that buyout is taxed also. And so like these are information that's not given to tenants, and oftentimes the tenant has already accepted the buyout and at that point has already agreed to take it, and now they have no place to go but the shelter, right?
And so this gets into kind of coupling the law with the actual enforcement and
Right.
implementation. So let's talk about that a little bit. So Jackie, I'll start with you. You kind of touched on it. You know, with all of these laws and with things that are actually putting it on the landlord, say, to self-report or the tenant in some cases. So are there ways the city can more proactively enforce those laws? What are the barriers to that? And what are you seeing so far in your role?
All right, well, I'm going to answer that, but I want to say two things about this. You know, I do think that in the dialogue we all have, particularly those of us that identify ourselves on sort of the left or in a pro-tenant stance, we do have to acknowledge that the other half of what's going on here is that incomes haven't grown, and that incomes are flat or declining, and that many of the people that I worked with when I was first deputy commissioner of the Department of Homeless Services, many of the people that tenant organizers work with and legal service providers work with, that the reason lots of people don't have stable housing is because we have failed to make sure that incomes are stable and growing with costs. I do think that there is this dual crisis going on, and when in the housing space we don't talk about both of those things, we sort of cheapen the debate, and also we narrow the types of responses that policymakers can bring to the table, right? So we need income responses. I think our administration, the de Blasio administration, actually has had a quite robust response on the income side, and we're sort of pushing we're as much as we can have been pushing the limits. People that come after us need to push those limits far further. So, but I do want to say that there is this, because this question of tenant instability versus illegal behavior, some tenant instability, lots of tenant instability is not actually about landlord illegal behavior. It might be about landlord market behavior, right? It might be that there are landlords not breaking the law, acting in their own market interest, and that's causing instability. But there's sort of not a law that's going to get to that, right? I mean, there are laws that are going to get to that. There's not a law on the agenda that's going to get at that right now. And I think we have to acknowledge that as policymakers and sort of leaders in the space. Do you want to say
Brent.
something before I answer
Go
the
ahead,
next
Brent.
question?
Yeah.
You look like you do.
Yeah, he does,
I
yeah.
agree with you. I don't disagree with any of that. I do think, I mean, there's other, other forces at play. I mean, supply obviously makes a difference as well.
Yeah.
I do think there are laws that do get at the market. Like, I do think the new rent laws are gonna
Yes,
significantly get rid of a lot of speculation, at least in the rent stabilized sphere. I do think there are sociopathic landlords, and they're just crazy. Like, we all know them. They're sociopathic lawyers or sociopathic politicians. I mean, they're all across the
Policymakers.
board, right?
Furman Center executive
But
directors.
like, a lot of what was occurring is market driven. Like, it's just landlords are trying to make money. I mean, if we have a capitalist system for housing, that is what they're going to do. And I think going back to like how nimble we need to be, I'm like really excited about what happened with the rent laws. But now I'm kind of thinking, all right, what's next? Like, where are things going to happen? Like, where? It's not like they're going to stop. The incentive to, like, private capital coming into the city, I hope is done. Like, I think they're not going to invest in the way that they used to, speculating on rent stabilized buildings, flipping them like stocks. But there's probably longer term ways of making money. I mean, the way you make money on a building is either increase the rents and or lower the expenses, which is not doing,
Lower the quality.
right, lower quality. And that's going to keep on going. And I think we have to like think through what's going to occur next, right?
So
Right.
can I?
So
go
now,
ahead.
just to
Yeah.
go back to your question,
Sorry.
so I would say that's a great segue. So from the city's perspective, we believe part of our role is to really take a deep dive and understand, try to be ahead of what these new, I don't want to call them new loopholes, but what these new models will be, right? And so from the city's perspective, what we're doing right now is putting together the data that I think not only the city will need, but the city will need, the state will need, the advocates will need, that we'll all need to really understand how did this change the market, to really understand what are there new abuses, what are those new abuses, and how do you get ahead of it? So that's the first thing. The second thing we're doing, sort of going back to we live in a really big city, is we're working with advocates to try to figure out how do you get tenants as educated as humanly possible on what their rights are, because they're going to have to help us enforce. There's no enforcement regime around that doesn't start at the tenants, period. And the tenants feeling empowered and organizing is a big part of that. Organizing is really different than educating. It's building power, right? So particularly in a market-driven system, you've got to help people build real power. And I would say, and I don't know how many people in the room are students, someone on the panel said it, the hard thing is the how, the hard thing is the implementation. Actually, I mean, like, it was really hard to pass these laws. I'm not dismissing that in any way, shape, or form. It's going to be even harder to implement them and to make sure that we leverage them as well as we can. And so thinking about the how is what we're all doing today. I don't think any of us have
So I can
a
have
clean
I can
answer.
have one proposal since we're here, right? So Jackie, the how. First, we can start with language access. Number one, right? Most folks in the Bangladeshi community have limited English proficiency. And so language is really, really important. And I'm not talking about language with Google Translate. Please do not use Google Translate, right? It is not effective. And I know HPD does this, and city agencies do this. And so I'm going to ask that you actually put money into a person that can actually translate, right, as their profession, to put out good quality information, because that's where it really starts. In order for me to educate the Bangladeshi community, I need information from the city and the state, right, to provide language access. That's like number one. And so that is one thing, like the how. That's something that we can do. It's doable. It's not something that's not doable. It's doable. And so we can get that in all the languages that we need in New York City. And let's start with the top 5, right? And make our way down.
So can I ask maybe a follow-up to you and Magda is, we talk about government and we talk about tenants, we've talked about the lack of self-policing of landlords. Do you see opportunities to partner with the highest quality landlords to be able to help implement these laws, or what is your perspective on that?
I welcome Zara Realty to meet me any day. Saturday, Sunday, I'm available. I live in Jamaica. I work in Jamaica. I see your buildings every day. I see your employees every day. I'm 100% open to working with landlords that are willing to take a step forward in changing their behaviors. And I think the first step in order to change their behaviors is, one, to recognize that they're doing a really bad job at being landlords, right? At abiding by the law. Once they're ready to accept, right? And I'm a social worker, and so the first step is like to get past denial, right? To get into acceptance. So unless you're gonna accept that, hey, maybe I've been doing something wrong and I'm in the wrong, how do I become a better landlord? How do I become a better person? How do I keep tenants that I'm renting units to in the community? How do I make them thrive? Then we're not gonna get to the step where organizers and landlords can work hand in hand.
So take us a little bit into actually your operations. How do you become aware of issues and how do you strategize? Do you do it around specific laws or specific issues? At a
So
building?
me specifically, I do my work mostly around the South Asian community, and so it's more about listening to what people have to say as far as like, my landlord's doing this, they're not giving me my security deposit in 14 days, right? They're not accepting the new preferential rent. They actually raised it by $100 or $200. And so we try to understand first what the issue is, right? Do an assessment of what the real issue is. Some buildings it's repairs, some buildings it's not. It's straight up harassment. And so every building requires a different assessment, one. I don't ever going in assuming that the landlord's doing X, Y, and Z. I let the tenants tell me what it is that's going on. And then to strategizing. So if it's repairs, then as Magda said, doing an HP, right? If it's to the point where a tenant association is amazing and thriving, right? How do we convert those units? How do we build wealth, right, in the community? And so different strategies come from the different community members and what they actually want to do and having a fruitful conversation.
And so Erica, I can go back to you. I mean, I can say firsthand as well that implementation is the hardest part.
Yeah.
There's some stage of denial or something in there. But part of it is landlords are supplying housing. I mean, we've agreed that there are bad actors, but a majority are good. So are there ways or mechanisms in which there can be, the small subset of landlords, you can disagree, but Erica, yeah, the two, yeah, right. But Erica, I can say firsthand there are great landlords. But, so Erica, like, are there ways that the city can become more aware or make more aware to landlords or owners of property, both small and large, that it's not necessarily doing right now?
I mean, I think, we're talking about educating tenants, which is wonderful, but I think we should also be educating landlords. That's important as well. I mean, and again, I don't mean to keep going back to your slide presentation, but I think it was really telling. For various reasons, the landscape has gotten more and more complicated. And again, I'm the first to say there have been lots of incidents of wrongdoing that resulted in those laws. I'm also here to tell you that not every landlord is bad. And I've also worked with some really great landlords that want to do the right thing. They want to provide what we should see as an absolute fundamental right to tenants or provide homeownership opportunities. You bring up a really great point, Rima, which is we should also be facilitating and trying to help tenants become owners. That is one way to really empower yourself. But I do think it's really, really key to give people the benefit of the doubt and try to at least, if we're going to have this level of local laws, rules, and regulations, let's at least assume that landlords will at least want to do the right thing. We know that that's not always going to be the case, but if we're going to educate tenants, we need to educate landlords as well as professionals that serve professionals that serve landlords as well, whether it's attorneys or contractors or architects, engineers, you name it. Everyone needs to be fully aware of what's expected of them. Otherwise, it's regulation by gotcha, which is, by the way, very sensational and easy to do, but it's not fruitful. It's not right.
Yeah.
I think that's
go ahead,
right.
Jackie.
I mean, tenants need good landlords, right? And good landlords need to know the law to be good landlords. So I think that's right, that that as we put resources into making sure that tenants understand the law, we should be putting resources into making sure that landlords understand the law. I think for the vast majority of landlords, like for big landlords, they've got staff whose job it is to educate them on the law. And for tenants, they don't have the same type of resources to get themselves educated, right? And so I think that it is important that both actors here are well-educated actors, and that there isn't some massive asymmetry of information. I would say from the city's perspective, we have to resource making sure that tenants are educated. I'm not sure that it's the city's role to resource making sure landlords are educated, because I think the assumption we would make is that landlords have the resources available to them to get themselves educated. That there might be exceptions to that, but I would say that, like, I take it as the right thing to say. Landlords absolutely need to be educated. Whether or not it's the government's job there, I'm not sure.
And
Wait,
Go
I
ahead,
just
Brent.
want to respond to that.
Go ahead, Erica, and
Yeah. I think
Erica,
that
Magda, Brent.
The educating the landlord community takes many forms. So for
Yeah, fair.
example, you and Brent are going to participate on a panel at Nixon, and that's a way that you're just simply letting the community know what's expected of them. So it takes many shapes and forms.
That's
It does-
right.
And it's not necessarily like a big public resource push. Every little bit counts.
Yeah.
But I
That's
agree
fair.
with you. You don't have to be subsidizing the education of landlords, but every bit does count.
Yeah, that's fair.
Go, Magda, go ahead.
So I just wanted to say that, just from a broader perspective, part of the issue with housing is, as Erica was saying, not as Erica, as Jackie was saying, that part of the problem is the market forces. And there are just some things that shouldn't be as subject to market forces. And I think healthcare is the big one that everybody's talking about now. But housing is also one of those things that shouldn't be directly tied to market forces. Everybody should have a right to housing. And if you start from that perspective, then maybe you would have more decent landlords. And maybe tenants would be more involved in what's going on because they know that this is a right that they have, as opposed to what's happening now where most landlords are trying to squeeze every little penny out of a property without investing anything, and certainly without caring about the people that are living there. And tenants know that nobody cares about their living there, so they're trying to figure out, where can I go? Or am I just stuck in this one place that is not acceptable for me or for my family?
Yeah.
Yeah, just
Go
really
ahead, Brent.
fast. I mean, it's not true that we're more regulated now. I mean, the housing, when I started as a baby attorney in 2002, I have a book right now, it's this thick. There was so
born with
many, there's so
glasses.
many regulations. The difference is that they were tilted towards the landlords. And so landlords didn't complain about it. Now that there's more tilt towards tenants, they're complaining about it. And what was happening was that those regulations were distorting the market and people were taking advantage of them. And now we're trying to regulate it back so that there's less distortion in the market, that people are given information that they can't be gouged for application fees. They can't be gouged for security deposits. They can't, they get notice before they're evicted. And I think that's really, it's not over-regulation. What I do agree with you, Erica, is that I think it's government's job to have clarity in those regulations so that people know what they're supposed to do and not do. I absolutely agree on that, and I think right now we're in a transition, so there is some ambiguity, but that's going to get clarified quickly. I think different agencies are going to be promulgating regulations, and it will be there. But I think it's a misnomer to say that we're now all of a sudden highly regulated from an unregulated spot. I don't think anyone would ever say that about New York's.
Except
housing
I
stock.
think the examples are harassment and buyouts. So for example, you know my feeling on buyouts. Like buyouts are a very big problem, and instead of having like 10 different local laws to deal with them being a problem. Maybe there needs to be one big comprehensive fix to address the problems with buyouts, right?
That's
So,
called the rent stabilization changes. I mean, the housing stability, what is it,
Well-
HSTP, that's gonna hopefully get rid of it.
that could,
I
that
mean, that's
could
my
resolve
hope, is that
it.
we're not
So
gonna see an
let's, so
incentive.
let's go there. So let's just talk, we have a few minutes before we'll do Q&A. So we've talked about, there has been a lot of laws passed, local and state level, and maybe there will be some national laws too, we don't know.
Yeah,
So,
we would welcome that,
Yeah.
I think.
so
Not right
because of where
Not
we
right now.
are.
Not right
yeah,
now,
we-
please not
Too
right
much
now.
implementation.
There's a
Yeah.
couple that we're fighting right now, we
Yeah,
don't
right.
want those.
So at this point, do we need further laws to expand protections, or are we better off kind of letting these existing laws be implemented and flourish? Jackie, maybe I'll start with you.
Oh, it's so much easier to respond to someone else on that one.
Well, you were looking at me, so.
I was, because you were talking, Matt. Being polite. All right, here's what I will say, right? I'm going to get these numbers slightly wrong, so someone help me. 12% of the city's rental stock is public housing. Something like 45% is rent stabilized, rent controlled. The rest is unregulated. And let me speak just from my experience at the Department of Homeless Services. We were seeing over my tenure, and certainly if you look back over the last decade, a far greater percentage of our clients moving into completely unregulated housing with vouchers, right? Obviously with a voucher, than we saw in the era of Advantage, right? We saw in the era of Advantage more of our clients exiting to some rent stabilized units than we saw in our
Can you
in the
explain
current.
advantage to everybody?
So, sure, sorry. In the previous administration, there was a housing voucher program called Advantage. It was a wildly successful program. In fact, you can sort of tie the current numbers of homeless families in particular, but also homeless individuals or individuals experiencing homelessness, families experiencing homelessness, to the end of Advantage. The program ran sort of in the late 2000s, and then in 2011, it was ended with a phase-in ending to 2013, sort of phased in the end. And it created a massive crisis. The homeless system went from 34,000 people to 51,000 people virtually overnight. I mean, it took 2 years, but trust me, in running a system, that feels like virtually overnight. And it was the end of Advantage. That's sort of what drove that increase. When this administration got in, one of the first things the mayor did was create the LINK program. It was an attempt to replicate a program like Advantage, a voucher a city-based voucher that would help you move out of the homeless system and into stable permanent housing. That program has since evolved over the last several years and is now the city FEPS program. All of that said, just speaking from DHS, like if I were to speak as someone running the homeless system, I would say that as my clients move into unregulated private housing, that's a precarious place to be. What we do, I think is an open question, and I'm not going to, on this panel, sort of presume that any of us know exactly what the right answer there is. This summer, the mayor did express support in the value of something like Just Cause or Good Cause. The mayor is on the record in supporting the sort of end game there, or the values behind that type of legislation. Obviously, we just saw Oregon and California pass just California, like last week, he signed it, statewide legislation like that. But I think that's clearly the next frontier on this stuff.
Rima, do you want to go ahead and specifically if, one
I
of
think
the
everyone
thing
knows
is-
my answer, which is hell yeah, we need more regulation.
So where and
Yes.
how, or something like Just Cause, what populations does it serve that?
So
does it?
most folks know me as a community organizer, but I'm going to talk about like my personal experience. I'm a single family homeowner actually, and there's a lot of vagueness in that realm where tenants are not protected, right? There's a lot of speculation that happens in that market, one. Basements are not legalized, even though we know that a large portion of people live in basements as kind of the last affordable types of housing, but for whatever reason, the city doesn't want to legalize them. I know we have a pilot program going on that was picked in the worst spot it could be picked in because architecturally, it's just not fit to house people safely, right? It's kind of setting up that pilot program for failure in a way. When we know that certain locations like Jamaica or Richmond Hill can thrive by legalizing basements. When we pay a high market rate for a single-family home, then what do we get forced to do to make our mortgage? We get forced to create illegal dwellings, right? We know people in smaller families, homeowners, they end up chopping up units, right? Which puts the burden on homeowners, right? When they get fines and stuff like that you end up having to pay. And so you become in this precarious kind of position. Then the homeowner ends up foreclosing sometimes, right? And if people haven't been following the foreclosure crisis, it's coming back up. And so we need a lot more regulations for units that are below 4 units, to be honest, because people are being housed in those units, whether we want to accept it or not. And there's very little protections right now for people that are on vouchers or just living there. Landlords don't have to renew their lease; they can just immediately kick someone out. They can just say that I want my sister to live there instead and push somebody out, even if that's not the case. I've seen this a lot when somebody calls HPD to get an inspection and the homeowner's not home, right? How do you access the boiler? And nobody's there to open the door for them. And so there's a lot of grayness in this particular part of housing. And I know some homeowners probably won't agree with me, and that's okay, that's fine. But I think there's just not enough regulation when it comes to the smaller units, like four and under.
And do you think that the city's harassment definitions don't get at the behavior you're talking about? You're talking more about natural kind of turnover.
Yeah,
and things
we
like
all know
that.
harassment is very hard to pinpoint. Even with the definition being a little more concrete and including a little bit more, it's still very hard to prove. You kind of tenants oftentimes talk about harassment after the fact, right? And throughout the time that they've been harassed for 5 or 6 years, they're not collecting any evidence. They're not attorneys. They're not organizers that understand that only evidence holds up in court, right? They're not recording anything. They're not putting anything in paper. All the conversations that they're having is verbal most of the time, right? And so harassment to this day, I feel like is very hard to prove. Very, very hard. I don't know who has proven it, but it's very hard. In the 3 or so years that I've been organizing, I've never been able to prove harassment.
Magda, do you see people, your clients, coming out of the unregulated stock? Do you see cases there, the smaller buildings that the Good Cause Eviction is looking to legislate against?
For sure. I mean, we have, obviously in Manhattan, Brooklyn, obviously in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Bronx, we have a larger number of regulated units, but in Queens and Staten Island, actually in large parts of Brooklyn, we have a lot of unregulated tenants, and it is a problem. And while these laws help, they only help for a period of time. So you can bring a harassment case, and if you're lucky enough to win, you won't be evicted that year, but then next year, there's nothing to stop the landlord from saying, I just don't want to renew your lease.
Right.
And that's it, they just don't want to renew the lease. Just cause is something that's needed. I mean, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. There has to be a right to housing. Like, people shouldn't have to live in shelters, definitely should never have to live on the streets. People should have decent housing. And that unregulated market, the small units, and well, it's not just the smaller units, the under 6 unit properties, but also any property that's come out of rent regulation, because we all know that a lot of our clients are double and tripled up in these apartments that are renting for $5,000 and $6,000, because that's the only way that they could pay the rent. But for those people, they're also at risk, because there's nothing to protect them. There's something to protect them only for a certain period of time, and then after that, they're at the mercy of the landlord.
Sure.
Just
Brent, go ahead.
I think it's also important upstate. A lot of localities, it's for code enforcement. I mean, basically, tenants who don't have any rights will not report conditions. They won't let inspectors in because they're concerned. We're getting reports of that upstate quite a bit from some of the smaller towns and cities and whatnot. And so I think it's really, without taking a position myself or our office, I think it's, we do care about habitability, and I think it's an important tool for habitability's sake.
Great. So we're going to actually move to Q&A, but before we do that, I just want to thank the panel for such a good discussion. Oh, this is a great question. This won't put you guys on the spot at all. Okay. First part is, what is the biggest issue plaguing low-income tenants? And if you could write one new law or revise an existing one to address it, what would it be? So who would want to volunteer to go
I
first?
think
Rima.
I'm sorry, but like I think coupling the word plaguing and low income, that's racist in itself, right? There's nothing plaguing low income tenants. We know that we know that there are root issues at this, and so there's nothing plaguing low income tenants. It's racism, it's sexism, it's all the isms that you can think of. That's the issue, right? So let's just be very clear not to put this stigma on tenants that oftentimes happens, which is that they're poor, they don't know how to keep their apartments clean, they break things, they don't know how to pay rent, they don't know how to budget. Let's stop having that conversation. It's 2019, right? Let's stop stigmatizing people.
So maybe, thank you. So maybe a better way to ask it is, what laws would target some of the things in people's lives that are making it difficult to afford rents or stay in their home or have the choice to stay in their home?
Start hiring people for well-paid positions, right? People of color in particular. Start paying people livable wages. That's like key. If you're not going to pay people livable wages, then regulate the market, the housing market, because we all need, again, housing is a human right. Like we all need a place to live in order to thrive. In order to take your medication for diabetes, you need a refrigerator to store it. Like, I mean, these are just like the most basic, simple things that you need. You need housing and you need food. Without those two things, it's very hard for you to go look for a job, to go to school, and to be able to prosper in anything that you do in your life.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked on the panel about this being a comprehensive issue, right? That we have a market issue, we have a market shortage, we have a lot of pressure, we have speculation. I think maybe another way to ask this is, of the local laws or at the local level, since we have passed a lot, what is the expectation as these are implemented going forward, or what new legislation might be on the table? If it is on the income side, or if it is on the economic development side, how would those efforts, could we see that as helping solve for the housing issue, or are they seen as divorced from each other? Go ahead, Jackie.
I'm not going to venture suggesting a local law because I'd like to, continue to have my job. But I will say I do think we have to nest the severe crisis we have around housing inside the crisis we have around poverty, and inside the crisis we have around income, right? And that, I couldn't agree more. Housing's about dignity. I think part of sort of what people are saying is housing's about dignity, and there are certain things we have decided require solutions because they're about people's dignity. We haven't made the same decision on housing. And I don't mean we, New York City. I mean sort of we, the country, has not made the same decision about housing. I think we're moving in that direction. I think actually part of like sort of the presidential election happening right now is moving us in that direction. But I will say that I think that it's instructive for me to think of these issues as intimately linked, and that just opens up the possibilities, right? It sort of just blows open the how do you solve for this problem. Rima started with pay people a living wage as the answer to what's the next law on housing. That should inform all of us.
And I just want to add, like, statewide, a lot of our tenants are already working to draft up new legislation because we're going strong, to be honest. And if you haven't joined our movement, you can still join our movement. So in the coming year, I know that we want to still eliminate MCI. That is
Can you explain MCI?
yeah,
to
so MCI
everybody?
is major capital improvements. So it's when a landlord does work that benefits kind of all the tenants. So boiler, elevator, roofing, those things that all the kind of tenants benefit from. But unfortunately, right now, what happens is the cost is put onto tenants. Even though I pay for a window, I can't take the window with me when I leave. And so tenants and organizers, we just don't understand why a tenant would have to be burdened with the price of doing improvements in a property that the landlord then benefits from, whether they sell it or keep the building. That, to me, is just insane. You know, it's like going to a salon and paying for a haircut, but then having to pay for the scissor that the person used to do the haircut. These are just, some of the most insane laws that still exist. We were able to decrease the cap on it, and I think DHCR is still trying to figure out what's considered an MCI and what's not. We're also going strong on good cause. I think we really need it statewide. We need to follow California and pass this next year. And locally, we're trying to push for Right to Counsel 2.0. Where we increase the income eligibility. So Right to Counsel is where tenants are kind of provided a right to an attorney to fight in housing court. We know that when tenants don't have attorneys, they, in most cases, unfortunately, end up being evicted or signing something that they completely don't understand or agree to. And so we're asking the city to increase the income eligibility and also like to help fund organizing work, because organizing work does help curb displacement. It helps people get educated, it helps people get organized and to stay in their community, to fight to stay in their community.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to move to the next question, and I'll say somebody basically asked a question that you guys went to, so we'll table that one. So Erica, this is actually for you. So are your good actor clients accepting that they'll continue to make repairs, but it will just take longer to recoup the cost? Or is there an acceptance that you might not just do the repairs?
So I've seen some different responses. I mean, a lot of my clients are, of course, really good actors, and so they're willing to do whatever the law requires. So they're just going to do the repairs and figure out, how to deal with the financial consequences. I have had some clients that have said that for them, it doesn't make financial sense, and they're concerned that, making the repairs it won't work for them financially. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. But, this whole concept of decommodifying real estate is, I think it's something that we're gonna have to look at. I mean, the bottom line is that a lot of landlords do own property as investments. And if we want to change that, that's fine. But in terms of, your previous question about what new laws do we need, I don't think we need any more laws about enforcement and bad actors and whatnot. I think if we're really trying to change the real estate landscape, then we've got to come up with maybe some mechanisms to try to promote tenants becoming the owners of their properties, or greater incentives for not-for-profits to own properties, because, again, landlords are generally in the business to own properties for profit. And if we want to remove that, I think we have to accept that they may not want to own property anymore.
So speaking of money, says doing a lot with a little. Why doesn't the city just increase funding and staff for enforcement?
Great question.
So I won't put you on the spot again.
Well, let
but-
me start and I will pass over. So, the city used to be aided in a big way by the feds and the state on this stuff. And in fact, the city has transferred and increased our enforcement budget. I'm not going to be able to recall the exact numbers. Next time I shall. over, say, if you like sort of look over a decade, right? But but when the feds pulled out and when the state pulled out, we were left holding the bag, as the city is over and over and over again. Let's be honest about sort of in this space whether or not the city has shouldered our fair burden here. So I would say that when you're trying to tackle a problem of this scale and this scope, you need all of government aligned. And that, you know, we need our federal partners back on some of this stuff. We need our state partners back on some of this stuff. We need to align our resources appropriately. You know, the other thing I would say, choosing words carefully, the city's enforcement currently largely relies on a complaint-based system. Can you imagine the outcry if we didn't do that? Right? Can you imagine if we said, well, in an effort to be better at enforcing A, B, and C, we need to shift our enforcement resources into a proactive, data-driven deployment. And that's going to mean that when you call, we're not necessarily coming. That would also be an outcry, right? And so we're constantly balancing risk and we're constantly balancing needs. But yeah, I would just sort of, my answer to that question is we welcome the federal government back into helping us resource these efforts.
Go ahead, Rima.
I just had 2 comments. So one to Erica. So for landlords who are having issues during repairs, there's something called a J51. You can apply for it through the city to help you with some of those major capital improvements that we talked about earlier. There's also a hardship program. All you got to do is open up your books. It's not that hard, but unless you're willing to open up your books and show hardship, you can't get money from the city to do those repairs. So I don't really understand what the issue is around that landlords are not going to do repair. They're going to let them go into despair. I don't think that we should not go towards the route of where the Bronx was burning, right? And landlords escaping with millions of dollars through insurance money. We've seen it. We know what you're up to, right? There are already programs that can help you do those things, to do the repair. So just open up your books, right? Like, show us where the money's going and come in. And then I think, sorry, I lost. Enforcement.
Federal funding and enforcement.
Yeah, so my comment to that is that we are a very rich city, and if we have enough money to give Jeff Bezos money to come here, to come to Queens, then we have enough money to do enforcement on housing.
So this is the last question, and then we'll go. So it's a 2-part question. To what extent do you believe these regulations will help resolve the affordable housing crisis? What other steps should the city take in tandem with these regulations? Magda, maybe I'll start with you. I think part of this is, there's another question that we kind of went to, is maybe with all the protections in the world, people have income volatility or have an inability to come up with the rent or other issues. So we talked on a high level about, you know, we need better paying jobs and things like that. But are there other things, like more precisely about, you know, when you're at that moment in housing court or before you get there, are there things we could do to help people avoid getting to that spot?
I think that the laws, while they're meant to help stave off the further erosion or the further decline of affordable units, they're not meant, the laws aren't meant to create affordable units. That's not what they're doing, which is something that's needed. And they also are not reversing the fact, they're not reversing anything that happened. So a lot of units currently are not affordable. And there's nothing in these laws that's going to make them affordable, certainly to my clients. So we have to look at other things. And the other things, it's everything that has been said. I mean, we have to look at living wages. We have to look at making sure that making sure that tenants know what their rights are. we have to make sure actually that landlords know what their rights are. We need to be able to have a society that is invested in having housing that is available to all of its members. And we don't have that. We don't have a society that's invested in that.
Okay, well, so on that note, I'll say thank you to our panel again. Wonderful. And thank you for everybody for coming.